I am in Anadarko, Oklahoma at the National Hall of Fame for Famous American Indians. Now the museum itself is closed. I believe it's been closed since the beginning of the pandemic, so we won't be able to see the exhibits inside, but there are a lot of busts on this trail behind it. The Hall of Fame was established back in 1952 and currently has 41 inductees. Unfortunately, the inside museum is closed right now. It looks like some of the busts are in there. This monument is dedicated to Betty Butts, the sculptress who made many of the busts here. There's also this bronze sculpture of some howling wolves. And here's another one depicting a grizzly bear and her cubs. This is a painted buffalo sculpture outside the Hall of Fame. And now we'll take a look at the busts spread throughout this national mall for Native Americans. The first bust depicts Simon R. Walking Stick, a Cherokee attorney who was on the Dawes Commission to divide land among the tribes. This is Allen Wright, aka Kiliahote, who was the chief of the Choctaw Nation for a time and gave Oklahoma its name. Here is Pocahontas herself, the legendary Powhatan who's been a bit fictionalized, but she did significantly aid the starving Jamestown colonists during the first years, and she eventually married John Rolfe and moved to England. This is a bust of Black Beaver, who was a Delaware interpreter for the American Fur Company and essentially established the California and Chisholm trails. Towards the end of his life, he had a ranch here in Anadarko. Here is Osceola, the Seminole chief who led his people's resistance in Florida during the Second Seminole War, though it was ill-fated. Here's one of Oklahoma's favorite sons, Will Rogers, who was quite the celebrity during his lifetime. He was a world-famous humorist, writer, and actor, and he was a Cherokee citizen born in the Cherokee Nation here in Oklahoma. Those roots were and still are often overlooked. This is Roberta Campbell Lawson, a Delaware who was the national president of the General Federation of Women's Clubs USA in the 1930s, so she advocated native arts and cultures at that time. This is a bust of Jose Maria, the chief of all Caddo tribes in the mid-19th century. He led his people from their homeland around the Brazos River in Texas to settle here in Anadarko in 1850. Here's First Lieutenant Pascal C. Pula, a decorated Kiowa soldier who earned 42 medals and served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, where he was killed trying to rescue one of his wounded men under fire. This is John Ross, the Cherokee chief and statesman who tried to adapt and use the American legal system to maintain their homeland in Georgia, but Ross was eventually forced to lead the Cherokee removal, the Trail of Tears, out here to the Indian Territory. This is a bust of Corporal Mitchell Red Cloud Jr., a brave Winnebago soldier who gave his life to save his comrades in Korea. He was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. This is Stand Watie, the Southern Cherokee chief during the Civil War period. He did side the Southern Cherokee with the Confederacy and was a Confederate general. He was actually the last Confederate leader to surrender. Here's a bust of Pushma Taha. He was the Choctaw chief known for his war and diplomatic skills. He actually sided with the United States during the War of 1812, unlike many other tribes who sided with the British, and he ended up on good terms with later President Andrew Jackson. Looks like they have some pedestals for future Hall of Fame inductees. Here's Muriel Wright, an Oklahoma historian who wrote extensively about Cherokee, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole history and languages. Alice Brown Davis was the first female Seminole chieftain, appointed by President Warren Harding to that position in 1922. This is a bust of Kicking Bird, the chief of the Kiowas during the 1870s, and he was given that name for the way he fought in battle during the Indian Wars, though he did often advocate for peace. He also had a mysterious death at nearby Fort Sill. This is Tishomingo, the war chief of the Chickasaws, and was also the leader and advisor for the Treaty of Pontotoc in 1832, though he did eventually have to lead the Chickasaws out west. This is a bust of Vice President Charles Curtis. Yes, there was a part Native American vice president of Kansas descent 90 years ago. Injun Charlie Curtis, as he was known, was elected as vice president in 1928 with Herbert Hoover, and he's still the only part Native American to reach the executive branch. Looks like they have some reindeer and tree-shaped Christmas lights out at the moment. At the back of the Hall of Fame, there's this rocky fountain that's not on at the moment, but I bet that does look pretty cool when it is running. This is Sacagawea, or Sacagawea, the Shoshone woman who helped lead the Lewis and Clark expedition to the Pacific Ocean and back. She is perhaps the most famous Native American in the history of the United States, and I have been to her supposed grave in Wyoming, so I'd recommend a look at that if you want to learn more about her. Here's Victorio, the Apache chief who was known for his leadership during Victoria's War from 1879 to 1880. Though his army never peaked over 200 men, he simultaneously battled the United States, Mexico, and civilian settlers in order to protect his own lands, though he and most of his followers were killed in 1880. Tohasan here was a Kiowa chief, elite warrior, and diplomat. He negotiated the first treaty between the Kiowas and the United States, and he also was a teepee painter. This is Quanah Parker, the chief of the Quahati Comanches. He led the Red River War against American bison hunting, though he eventually had to surrender and lead his people to the reservation at nearby Fort Sill. And Americans did almost hunt bison to extinction. Here's Pontiac, the Ottawa chief who led battles against the British during the 7 Years' War throughout Michigan and the Great Lakes region. He sieged Fort Detroit, and towards the end of the war when he withdrew, the British did issue the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited settlers west of the Appalachians and preserved the Midwest, temporarily, for Native Americans. This is a bust of Major General Clarence L. Tinker, an Osage who went on to be the commanding general of the U.S. Air Forces in Hawaii during World War II, though he was killed during the Battle of Midway. This is Stumbling Bear, who became the Kiowa chief at the age of 22 for his leadership in battle. He led war parties against the Navajos and Utes during the 1850s and fought Kit Carson in Texas. He did eventually sign the Medicine Lodge Treaty and sought peace for the Kiowas. Little Raven, also known as Hosa, was the chief of the Southern Arapaho in the 19th century who negotiated peace between tribes and secured rights to the Cheyenne Arapaho Reservation. This bust depicts Setanta with his headdress on. He was the Kiowa war chief and also known as White Bear. He is regarded as one of the best Native American leaders during the Indian Wars period and was referred to as the Orator of the Plains. He did sign the Medicine Lodge Treaty, but even after the treaty he did participate in some battles against the US, and because of that he was incarcerated and eventually killed himself in prison. You can see he is wearing a Washington Peace Medal. This is Louis Tawanama, an Olympian of Hopi descent who received a silver medal at the 1912 Olympics, and won more than 25 track records. This is a bust of Chief Cochise of the Chiricahua Apache. He is most known for being falsely accused of a kidnapping, after which members of his tribe were killed by US soldiers, so the plaque states that he became a bitter enemy of the white man. Here is Tecumseh, the great Shawnee warrior and statesman who led a confederation of tribes to attempt to limit American settlers in the Midwest and Mississippi Valley, and to preserve their lands and cultures, but he lost a string of important battles such as the Battle of Tippecanoe and was eventually defeated and killed at the Battle of Thames. Holstein Claw was an important Navajo medicine man, chanter, and weaver. The sign states that his sand paintings were viewed by FDR in 1934. Here is T.C. Cannon, a Kiowa and Caddo artist who lived in Santa Fe and led the new wave of contemporary native arts. This is Geronimo, the famed Apache medicine man who led raids against the United States and Mexico over decades to preserve their way of life, though he surrendered and was imprisoned many times. In fact, he even exhibited himself while in prison to make money and agreed to participate in Teddy Roosevelt's inaugural parade. Hiawatha was a Mohawk chief in the late 16th century. He did promote universal peace and was a co-founder of the Iroquois Confederacy, which lasted for quite a while and had some influence on the US Constitution down the road. This is a bust of Jim Thorpe, who was part Potawatomi, and he was essentially the world's greatest athlete during his heyday. and was one of the most well-known Americans around the globe, as he won the Stockholm Olympic Games in 1912. Here's Chief Joseph, who led the Nez Perce people throughout a really terrible period when they were removed from their homeland and spent much time attempting to find refuge. They actually attempted a fighting retreat to escape to Canada, but they were cornered a short ways from the border. He lived out the rest of his days at a reservation. And finally, here's Sequoyah, who invented the Cherokee alphabet, making the Cherokee the first indigenous group in America with a written language. But he still got removed out here with the rest of the Cherokee. So this is a really great Hall of Fame displaying Native American history that is often overlooked, and it's interesting to see them presented in a European monument form. Anyways, I do want to return to Anadarko, known as Indian City, USA, to visit the other interesting museums here that are closed right now during COVID. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Also, take a look at my other videos on historic sites and museums, including those based on Native American history, and thanks for watching.